Well, for a little bit more on this, we're now joined by the Deputy Director General of the Economic Policy and Planning Portfolio in Gauteng, Jak Koseff. Thanks so much indeed for joining us and welcome to the program.
Absolute honor to be here, Peter. Thank you so much for having us.
All right, the Township Economic Development Bill. It sounds very exciting, just the name by itself, but let's strip it down now and tell what it does.
So the core of the bill is the ability to create a new kind of economic geography that we call the Township Enterprise Zone. So what it effectively allows government to do is to designate special areas that get special kinds of treatment. And that includes across broad swathes of areas that we declare. There will be specialized bylaws that make it much easier to run and operate a business. There will be, for example, prioritization for procurement from those areas by government and prioritization for the financing of those areas by, or for businesses that operate in those areas at least, by our new Township Economy Partnership Fund, which is a wholesale funding platform we've set up with the IDC that basically funds non-banks to run financial services that target township enterprises in a more agile way. The bill also, well, now it's the Act actually, the bill, now that the Premier has signed it, the Act also creates a variety of other mechanisms that government can use to intervene, specifically allowing for the idea of us creating specialized precincts in townships that we can then add additional programmatic regulations and other kinds of support to in order to bring them to life. So, for example, where you look at very much high capacity, high economic potential areas that are underutilized, like taxi ranks, where you've got 6 million people passing through the taxi system, the minibus taxi system in Gauteng on a daily basis. It's a ridership the size of the New York City subway system, yet we don't have a commuter economy and an automotive economy that really surrounds it, that takes full advantage of that. So the bill gives us the ability to focus precinct level regulation and programs by law on specific precincts within the zones. We're also looking very actively at what other spheres of government, obviously besides the municipal sphere, can do to really enhance this. And one of the major areas we're negotiating, for example, is what kind of tax incentives can be applied to those who bring investment into these new township zones as well. So it creates a legal mechanism for us to target and then what we call stack benefits, going to the enterprises and the people in those zones that are most capable of creating jobs and expanding opportunities in exactly the areas where the largest pools of our workforce currently reside.
All right, so we're going to unpack that a little bit more, but I just want to start by asking maybe, I remember people like Tamima Zwai speaking about the township economy years ago. And I just wonder why now? Why didn't you listen before?
I think there's always been the intention, certainly since I've been in provincial government and before that in local government, there's always been the intent to develop the township economy in a more pronounced way. The difference now really is that the legal mechanism that has been created, which is a much more ambitious exercise, has finally navigated the gauntlet of going through legislation, of getting the buy-in of all the different political constituencies, and has been fully brought to life. It's not as if nothing was tried before, but what was tried before was insufficient. So, for example, Gauteng provincial government under the 5th administration spent about 22 billion rand in procuring from township-based enterprises. But when you look at the data and the statistics that we gathered around the same period from enterprises operating in the streets of the townships of Gauteng, a statistic the Premier mentioned today, 9 out of 10 enterprises don't even have a business bank account. So even the 22 billion that we were pumping in over those 5 years was only going to about the 10% of businesses that would meet the compliance thresholds in order to be part of government's procurement chain. And I think the learning curve that came out of those years and realizing that even something, as scaled as that wasn't going to get the job done is what led the provincial government to really raise the ambition and recognize that we actually had to do subnational legislation that defined things specifically for Gauteng. So what we've done is created a way for Gauteng to use its regional economic policymaking power to really drive a new set of enabling mechanisms and tools for developing what were these historically dormitory areas into fully diversified economies.
All right. You've mentioned a few words which I'll pick up on. Enabling environment. And I just wonder, economic activity will happen regardless. Are we trying to formalize this informal economy that's been going on without bank accounts, etc., etc.?
So the reality on the ground, and I think the July unrest really brought this home. This is something that MEC Tau and the Premier have mentioned on numerous occasions. If you look at those that were caught in the crosshairs of the post-July chaos in Gauteng's townships, it were those that were living and operating their businesses under conditions of informality that were the most vulnerable and the least capable of accessing the assistance that was available from the state. Their employees could not access the TERS scheme. It was those businesses without any formal footprint that couldn't access SASRIA insurance. And the reality is that vulnerability deepened the extent to which they are, economically fragile and much less capable of being funded as job creators and expandable enterprises that can grow the economy. So we're not looking to impose red tape. We're quite the opposite, but we are looking to create a much more inclusive formality. And if you look at what will be coming out in the next couple of months with the draft model bylaw that the Act creates, you'll see that it's much more accessible rules, but rules that do require businesses to access the benefits by taking the first step onto a lower rung on the ladder of formality. Right. And in doing so, we will create good reasons for them to take that step, as in they'll be able to access financing, they'll be part of procurement pools, they'll be able to access markets they couldn't access before. But to do so means entering the space of the formal in a way that allows us to treat them as insurable, financeable, and therefore scalable enterprises that are able to create jobs.
So the next question might be, where does a township start and end? Because I might be not in the northern suburbs, I'm in Eldorado Park. Does that count as a township?
So the Act gives the MEC the power to designate what counts as and what is a township enterprise zone in geographically specific ways. We're obviously not going to do this just based on trivial considerations. We're being driven very much by data, and the data we're looking at looks specifically at questions of disadvantage. So sure, we start with the historic townships because this is a form of redress where we're looking at spaces that have been legally discriminated against by various historic legal regimes at various points and therefore have become underdeveloped. But to that, you need to add the kind of areas where people that might have lived in majority black townships or black townships that were legally constituted as such in the early 90s, there's now areas like informal settlements and areas adjacent to those townships that have become home to very similar kinds of populations. So there's a lot of logic in looking at disadvantage overall and understanding the question of a township enterprise zone as a mechanism that responds to disadvantage and then throws basically everything government can at the problem of disentangling the disadvantage and diversifying that piece of the economy. So there's definitely room for consideration, and we are going through this process over the next couple of months now that the bill is an act, considering which areas have the kind of disadvantaged profile that merits consideration as a township enterprise zone. And certainly, you mentioned Eldorado Park, the old colored townships as they're often known, is definitely part of that envelope. as are the informal settlements, as are parts even of our deconstructed or disadvantaged CBDs that have fallen into disrepair over the years. So if an area is a home to disadvantaged populations where all these kind of thorny conditions of poverty conspire to make the economic conditions worse, and we can remedy that with the Township Enterprise Zone designation, there's good reason to actually include those areas in the list of Township Enterprise Zones.
I get a feeling that this can only work if big business, private sector in general, established businesses partner fully with you and partly are incentivized.
Yes. So that's very much the way we see it. And there's a few levels at which that works. So number one, we are a relatively large-scale spender. You know, so the Gauteng provincial government, for example, in any given year is 145 billion odd, spending organization. Of that, there's basically about 45 billion that is goods and services, and we are targeting 17 billion of that at these township enterprise zones. Obviously, to make that work, you've got to have capacity to supply out of the zones, and that's why we're also very carefully targeting our enterprise and supply development financing at the same areas. So this notion of benefit stacking. However, that's only going to really work to scale and really reduce unemployment if the private sector follow us. We've got good reason to suspect they will, even if they're not our suppliers, largely because of the incentivization we're looking at, for example, from the tax system, where we are looking at with National Treasury, how we can meaningfully incentivize investment into these areas without burdening the fiscus unduly. So, for example, if you consider the possibility of creating tax breaks on the cost of labor or tax breaks on the investment, or the investment taxation that goes with capital, you can start moving some of the 16 trillion rand that's sitting in assets under management in places like the Sandton Square Mile and start directing it towards places like these township enterprise zones. So ultimately, what's going to make the difference is whether or not private sector players feel that they've got a commercial case to go there. And us de-risking that process through, for example, the more inclusive bylaws, the more inclusive financing, the targeting of enterprise and supply development, the programmatic enhancement of precincts. These are the kind of measures that will create more confidence among certain partners. And to be fair, we're already sitting with well over 35 different partners, looking at about 65 different precincts that we're targeting in the provisional zones that we're looking at establishing. So it's not as if the private sector is staying thoroughly away, but it's going to need much more mobilization as we roll the Township Economic Development Act out. And all kinds of levels of incentivization will make a difference. But what we can't get away from, and what we think is really a great predictor of success, is this is a huge market for the private sector as well. You crack the consumer and the productive and service generating markets in townships, you create massive capacity that makes a whole lot of money, not only for township businesses, but for those who invest in them both within and outside of townships. And we are determined to make that case to the outside world at all levels.
All right, huge potential, as with most things, but the proof is in the pudding. So when can we have our next conversation where you can say to me, this was our target, this is what we've done?
So we're looking at having the first zones declared by the end of June. That's the target the MEC has set. We've got to promulgate regulations and a few other procedural things. We are doing some prototyping of the kinds of activities that will define the zones within that time frame. And we're also working with the various departments across Gauteng provincial government to consolidate things like the enterprise and supply development, social impact and skill spending that would be required under BBBE legislation. So we converging all of that is definitely work that we'll be going through over the next 2 to 3 months. We would argue by the end of this calendar year, you should be seeing meaningful examples of what we're talking about sprouting all over the key areas that we've declared. Obviously, there is a dependency on the communities and the business groupings in those areas following us. But the indications we got from the signing event today, the event that basically enacted the bill into an act, it was that just about every level of business formation wants this and wants to work with us to make it succeed. So I think, Peter, if we talk within the next 3 to 6 months, we'll have some details to give you already. This isn't something you've got to wait 2 years to realize, but certainly, within the next 12 months, as we move towards the end of the 2022-2023 government financial year, you should be seeing significant job numbers and significant investment numbers going into townships. Remember also that alongside the Township Act signing today, we also announced the first disbursement from our Township Economy Partnership Fund that's actually leveraged government money plus private sector money to go as wholesale funding to, in that case, the SASME Fund, who are going to be running all kinds of interesting financial services that are much more agile than what banks can do. So you'll also be able to see the results of that within the coming 3 to 6 months, which is also a worthwhile conversation.
Mr. Koseff, I'm so glad we've got this all on tape and we're going to play it back for you. But we wish you the best of luck, great initiative, and let's just hope that it does bear the fruit that we hope. Thank you so much for your time and good luck.
Thank you so much.